So good morning. Hello, Yumi, everyone. It is a great pleasure and honor for me to welcome you all to this side event on women's economic empowerment in the changing world of work. My name is Atenasi Atta, and I'm moderating this side event for today. I work here at the Secretariat as a global coordinator for the Pacific Trade Invest Network, an agency for PIFs that works towards increased trade and investment in the Pacific region. Moreover, I come from background of private sector, my last job being the CEO for the Solomon Islands Chamber of Commerce and Industry. So this is a particular topic of interest to me personally too. This is one of the side events featured as part of the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, the CSW. Women's economic empowerment through participation in business is very important, whether through the creation of sustainable livelihoods or being involved in all levels of decision-making. Thank you, Otagio Tumas, to our host today, the Forum Secretariat, the Asian Development Bank's Private Sector Development Initiative, and SIPE, the Center for International Private Enterprise. It is great to see this spirit of collaboration. Before we hear from our amazing four panelists today, I wish to acknowledge the presence of the Fiji Permanent Representative to the United Nations, His Excellency Ambassador Satyandra Prasad, and the Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, Henry Puna. So I would like to take this opportunity to welcome Mr. Henry Puna, the PIF Secretary General, to give his introductory remarks.
Thank you, Moderator, Ms. Atta. His Excellency, Fiji's Ambassador and Permanent Representative to the UN in New York, my friend, Mr. Satyandra Prasad. And of course, our moderator, Ms. Atenasi Atta, Pacific Trade Invest Coordinator at the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, to the remarkable women panelists, and to all of you listening into this side event. Yorana Nisambula Vinaka, and warm greetings from the Blue Pacific this morning. It is indeed my pleasure to be part of the opening formalities supporting this Pacific side event at the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, the CSW. This event is indeed timely, given the topic for discussion, women's economic empowerment in the changing world of work. I recall that this was also one of the key issues deliberated on during CSW65. And given our current context, as we seek to recover from COVID-19 and return to some semblance of normalcy, it is an important theme to reflect upon. Women have been impacted similarly in many ways to men, yet differently as well. And this needs to be taken into account. As we enter CSW66, I noted the theme is focused on gender equality and empowerment in climate change. It is therefore important to identify pathways and opportunities for women in the workforce, in business, and in leadership within this frame. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought the world to a standstill. In doing so, it forced us all to really look at work and employment in a completely new light. Whether in the private sector or the public sector, the interface of work has changed, and employees were confronted with the changing modalities, the pace and the place of work. Women in particular have been disproportionately affected, especially for those that have had to work from home and had to manage their households at the same time. For us in the Pacific, this was glaringly evident as borders closed and tourism-dependent economies suffered in the aftermath. Tourism-dependent economies like Fiji, Palau, and the Cook Islands, for example, the shutdown of internet travel vastly affected GDP. According to the Asian Development Bank, for the Cook Islands, the decline was recorded at approximately 15.4% for year-end 2021. This decline in economic growth impacted employment and household incomes, and particularly for women who hold 60.5% of tourism-related jobs. In other economies, this included handicraft vendors, cleaners, fishers, farmers, and restaurant workers. But I'm especially happy to see Fiji's hotel and tourism executive here today and to share the experiences of her industry. The CSW agreed conclusions complement our very own efforts here in the region through the 2050 Pacific Strategy for the Blue Pacific continent. This strategy represents the region's ongoing commitment to work together to develop long-term and regional approaches to critical challenges, including addressing gender issues, and our women and girls have an important role to play in the effective delivery and implementation of the strategy. To realize this, there needs to be a commitment at national and regional levels on meeting global human rights and other international legal laws that recognize the rights of all people, protects and ensures that no one. I am pleased to report that in this regard, we have recently completed the review of the Pacific Leaders Gender Equality Declaration of the Women's Triennial Meeting for the region that was held last year. The discussions and recommendations formulated here today will be key in progressing efforts to address gender-based issues across the Blue Pacific. This will also feed into the CSW process and implementing the 2050 strategy. At this juncture, I would like to take the opportunity to thank the ADP Pacific Private Sector Development Initiative and the Center for International Private Enterprise for partnering with us at this important event today. I look forward to future collaboration with all of you and other partners on these important initiatives. I wish you all the very best in your discussions, and I, for one, am looking forward to the outcomes. Minaka wakalevu, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Secretary General, for your time and for your remarks this morning. So, giving us the opening address at this side event is the Ambassador Satyandra Prasad, Permanent Representative of Fiji to the United Nations. Ambassador Satyandra Prasad is Fiji's ambassador and permanent representative to the UN in New York and Fiji's non-resident High Commissioner to Canada. Ambassador Prasad has previously worked as the CEO of the Papua New Guinea Governance Facility, a senior advisor in the World Bank and in UK's Department for International Development. He has been an academic at universities of the South Pacific in Fiji, at University College Cork in Ireland, and Risto Mekan Asia Pacific University in Japan. Dr. Prasad studied at the University of the South Pacific, University of New Brunswick, United Nations University, and Warwick University. Ambassador Prasad is a climate and oceans champion, both within UN processes and in other multilateral settings. I welcome His Excellency to give his opening address. Thank you.
Thank you very much, moderator. It's Athanasi Ata. I hope you can hear me because you were breaking a little bit from the other end. Okay.
I can hear you. Thank you.
Secretary General, my dear friend, His Excellency Mr. Puna, fantastic panelists and dear listeners. First of all, thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to make a few remarks. It's unfortunate that Fiji's Minister for Women was unable to, due to unforeseen circumstances, deliver these remarks. It's also, Secretary General, unfortunate that Pacific Island Forum is not represented at the ministerial level at CSW beyond Fiji's minister. This is one of the CSW that is most consequential to Pacific, given the themes of disaster, climate and environmental focus. And because of COVID and the economic circumstances across many of our island countries, we have not been able to be represented at the highest level possible. But nevertheless, Secretary General, through you, if I can reassure women and girls across the Pacific that they are very well represented by the ambassadors and their teams in New York. I'm especially pleased to see that the side event is one that is focusing on the changing world of work, discussing the review theme. This is a perfect timing to not only reflect on what has happened, but also reflect on the challenges before us. And it is also an important moment to see how the world of work features in the CSW66 themes. We are all well aware that there needs to be far greater acknowledgement, recognition, and support to women as entrepreneurs, as business owners, as innovators, as employees, as coders, as executives in private sector, as both leaders and contributors to the whole suite of work skills, competencies, and business activities that are needed now to scale up and lift the Blue Pacific's ambition and commitment to climate change and reducing environmental risk and managing and responding to disaster risk. Further, that the far greater emphasis needs to be placed on education and skill development for girls, particularly in technical areas that are related to climate change and environment, on green jobs, on STEM subjects, as well as on some of the new skills where we are bringing, for example, traditional knowledge in the area of BB&J and the application to marine genetics. There are some issues that are confronting women and girls, COVID-19, in far more intense ways, such as COVID-19 and the pathway to recovery. And I look forward to listening and learning a lot more from the esteemed panelists this morning. Climate change and COVID-19 have exposed and exacerbated inequalities globally. They've had a devastating effect on vulnerable groups and societies. They've had an equally, if not more, devastating impact on gender inequality. Fiji saw this firsthand as borders closed and many in the tourism sector were employed in that industry. But we also know that in the Pacific, many are employed in the sectors that are at the greatest direct risk of climate impacts: agriculture, fisheries, tourism, technology, and that technology-led change and jobs founded in science, technology, engineering, maths, ICTs are putting further pressure on women's labor force participation opportunities in these new sectors. Last year, the Asia Foundation highlighted in their Future of Work report that COVID-19 exposed the vulnerability of workers in the old normal to unexpected shocks as a consequence of the pandemic. It is no surprise that such research and studies show the rationale for gender equality and greater workforce participation. It is clear that it helps reduce income inequality, increases economic diversification, boosts economic growth. And I need to say this, it's not in my speaking notes, it's even more beneficial to men than where they already are. The World Economic Forum predicts that closing the global gender gap in the labor market participation by 25% by 2025, 3 years from now, would add $5+ trillion to the GDP globally. Much research tracks the correlation between greater gender diversity in leadership and company performance and company outcomes. The ADB's Pacific Private Sector Development Initiative, which Secretary General referred to, Leadership Matters report for the Pacific findings suggest that the business community in the Pacific offers far greater opportunities for women to take on leadership roles than in the political sphere. The latter showing, the political sphere showing a 7% participation rate, which is amongst the lowest in the world. Our private sector in the region is making progress on gender equity and representation with an increasing proportion of women on boards, which is now averaging 22%. This exceeds the global average of 17%. This strengthening trend is also reflected through representation of women in South Pacific Stock Exchange listed boards, which rose from 12% in 2017 and nearly doubled to 24% in 2020. Also, women's representation in business leadership in the Pacific compares favorably with global averages, unsatisfactorily, but they are nevertheless with slightly higher than the global average. In the Pacific, on average, women hold 21% of board seats, 11% of board chair positions, and 19% of deputy board roles. I recognize and commend the efforts of Pacific Island Forum and Pacific governments to put in place measures to reduce gender gaps with such determination. However, we need to do a lot more. We must also emphasize that this has to be done in tandem with the private sector, so as to proactively engage women more fully in formal positions across the workforce in the private sector. This is where policy and regulatory frameworks and working on conducive policies is essential, and the need to bring them together. Pacific businesses are developing gender and diversity policies, including those focusing on capacity building, mentoring, and training. These efforts have given greater results in retention of women, and a higher proportion of women are beginning to take up management roles, as I've given in the figures above. This is a lesson also for those in the public sector, which is lagging. This may include a suite of training, policy development work, mentoring, to enable women to enter leadership roles in far greater numbers. A focus on science, technology, skills development, girls in science, and to further develop the skills that are needed for public sector senior employment, especially in the new emerging sectors such as in the green and the blue economy, would give a considerable boost to our climate and oceans ambitions. Before I conclude, Madam Moderator, allow me to acknowledge our collaborating agencies, the ADB, Pacific Private Sector Development Initiative, PIPS, and the Center for International Private Enterprise. I wish you all very well for the panel this afternoon, and look forward to listening to all the views. Thank you very much, and I wish women and girls across the Pacific a very successful CSW66, and I again reassure you that the ambassadors and their full mission teams across the Pacific Island missions are fully mobilized to ensure that CSW66 outcomes are extremely fruitful for women and girls across the Blue Pacific. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your thought-provoking opening remarks. So Target Tumas Meitaki Mata Vinakavaka Levu to the Ambassador and the Secretary General for joining us for this event. The remarks have set a strong base for our discussions today and reminded us a few things to reflect upon. Thank you very much for your insights and for your ongoing support. I wish you a good day or good evening ahead. Right, so we've moved on to the panel session. It is my pleasure to chair this event today. We have an amazing lineup of speakers, and I'm very excited to hear from them. I'm sure you are also. As the Ambassador and the Secretary General have alluded to, this side event is one hinged on a review on changing the face of work, but it also complements the CSW66 priority theme on achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental, and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. We need to find ways to reinforce the messages and have greater recognition and support to women in the private sector as both leaders and contributors to a suite of at-work and business activities in climate change, environment, and disaster risk. As the SG pointed out, the 2050 strategy and the regionalism focus places us right in the heart of it. And so we need to be thinking about girls and education, especially in STEM and prospects and the future of green jobs for women and girls. From the International Labour Organization to McKinsey, lots of literature have come out showing how COVID-19 has transformed the very nature of the employer-employee relationship. It has put into question many things we took for granted before the pandemic, such as being required to work on site. Many employees are now reconsidering what they want from their careers and how they want to work after many months of working from home. Pre-COVID, trends of women at the workplace and workforce was on the incline and showing positive progress. However, that has changed with the pandemic dealing a major setback to women. According to McKinsey, for example, 1 in 4 women are considering leaving the workforce or downshifting their careers versus 1 in 5 men. In the Pacific, many women lost jobs or had to choose between working and returning to home carer roles, especially as schools in the region closed. So without much further ado, let me introduce and invite our speakers for today. First up, we have Ms. Joni Simpson, who is the Senior Gender Specialist with the ILO office in Bangkok, Thailand, talking about women and work. Joni is perfectly placed to do this, and we look forward to hearing her insights. So just a bit of a background, Joni was ILO's global coordinator and specialist in women's entrepreneurship development and entrepreneurship education in Geneva for 7 years. Her current work focuses on women and youth in relation to entrepreneurship development and education. Her work aims at supporting the inclusion of marginalized populations in society. She provides technical guidance and supports on gender equality, non-discrimination, and women's economic empowerment approaches to ILO constituents and partners for policies and programs relating to jobs and entrepreneurship. She sits on an expert committee for the Global Women Entrepreneur Leaders Scorecard. So, Joni, there are 2 parts to your question today. Firstly, as Senior Gender Specialist, can you give us an overview, please, of your work? Secondly, as a Senior Gender Specialist, you would have seen changes to work, employment, and trends issues given your line of work, yeah? So what are some of the crucial advisories and activities that have been quite confronting that you've worked on in recent times that we here today should be mindful of? Thank you, Joni. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you so much. And good morning, everyone, Secretary General, distinguished guests, and panelists. I'm really honored to be here. I'm going to be talking a little bit about our work. I am, as was mentioned, a sort of a regional advisor, if I could say, and providing advice and guidance to our constituents on gender equality and diversity in the world of work. So at the ILO, of course, which is the UN agency for the world of work, we've been looking at the impacts of COVID on the labor force. And as was mentioned, women have been hit the hardest by COVID, and many women still haven't found their way back to the workforce, often due to care-related responsibilities. And that's very worrying because the gains that were made in the past for gender equality at work are being disrupted, and we need to take action on this. And of course, the private sector is a very important player in that. So proportionately, women were hit harder by job losses and in highly impacted sectors, tourism, services, garment, retail. And we saw that women's employment declined by 5% in 2020 compared to 3.9% for men. And 90% of women who lost their jobs in 2020 exited the labor force. Again, this is very worrying because we know from previous crises that women have a harder time rejoining the labor force. So more is necessary there. And often this was due to the intensified care responsibilities. So also need to mention that the pandemic has also disproportionately impacted the most vulnerable, and especially women in the informal economy. Workers in the informal economy have been 3 times more likely to lose their jobs than those in the formal economy, and have had disproportionate declines in their income, often are not covered by social protection. So companies, organizations, policymakers will need to look at their policies to build bridges for women to get back to the labor force and enable them to re-engage. And I'd like to pick up on 4 key areas that I work on, and that we see that gains can be made. And so one is supports to managing work-family responsibilities. That one won't surprise anyone. Skills in lifelong learning, just transition, and finally, women's representation and leadership. So first, on care responsibilities. In fact, even before COVID, women were doing on average 4 times more unpaid care work than men in the region. And COVID-19, of course, further exacerbated and shone light on those duties and showed how we all depend on care. The care is essential for our well-being. So we need to recognize the unpaid care work that women shoulder. And in Asia Pacific, unpaid care work is the top, and I can't say more importantly, the top obstacle for women getting in, staying in, and progressing in the labor force. And it impacts their choices, their ability to engage in skills and other activities. It means women on average work the longest days when paid and unpaid care duties are added up. And women face a motherhood pay penalty. Mothers tend to experience a motherhood wage penalty that can actually persist all along their working life, while fathers do not face this, this issue. Actually, it's been documented that they have a wage premium when they become fathers. So as long as social pressure continues to compel women to be the main caregivers in the household and men to work longer hours for pay as the main breadwinners, women will not be able to reduce their workload at home or increase their hours of paid work, and gender equality at work will continue to be elusive. But the good news is that we can do something about it, and a very strong means of addressing this, and in particular in the COVID times, where jobs have been lost, is in investing in public care packages and advocating for that. So including policies and services that support families to manage work and family responsibilities. And ILO just released a new report called Care at Work, and I'll share the link in the chat. On International Women's Day, we launched this, and the report finds a strong investment case for creating transformative packages of care policies based on country context, of course, and universal access that could create a pathway for building a better and more gender equal future of work. And persistent and significant gaps in care services and policies have left hundreds of millions of workers with family responsibilities without adequate protection. But the good news is that if we take this into account, meeting these needs would create almost 300 million jobs by 2035. So it's a job-rich sector. It's a sector that brings transformation. So we really need to rethink the way we provide care policies and services so that we all have access to care along the life cycle. And this will help alleviate poverty, encourage gender equality, and support quality care for children and the elderly, in addition to more decent jobs. The second issue, we also know that technology can be an enabler, but it isn't always, and there are barriers to access. And also we're concerned about violence and harassment, online violence and harassment at work, which affects women in particular. So technological advances have opportunities, but also affect certain sectors more than others. And women happen to be in those sectors that are more affected because the jobs that they are in are the more lower skilled jobs and sectors that are more at risk to automation. So we really do need to look at ensuring that skills upgrading policies and measures work intentionally to close gender gaps in skills, including through lifelong learning policies and support for working transitions when workers' jobs are displaced or they need to be absent from the workforce for caring. And just to close on that issue is that education and skills development matters, but it's not enough to achieve more gender equal world of work. Occupational segregation is still prevalent and women face an average of 20% pay gap throughout the world. So coming to just transition, we need to ensure that it does not reproduce the existing gender stereotypes and occupational segregation in the new jobs generated. So for instance, if we look at the energy sector, achieving gender equality in the renewable energy sector is crucial. So the ILO has put out just transition guidelines for taking this up, and upskilling and reskilling will need to be responsive to women's needs and different realities, as well as looking to policy packages, making sure that women are not left behind. And finally, there are still very much weaknesses in voice and representation of women in the world of work. And according to our data, it shows that women's membership in national social dialogue institutions only ranged from 20 to 35% on average. And that's far from reaching gender parity and making sure that women are able to bring their needs and perspectives and solutions to the table. And at the same time, the business case for women in leadership is available. More women in decision-making roles improves organizational performance. And we've done a great study around 13,000 companies across 70 countries, showing a clear business case for having more women in diversity and leadership. But too few women get to these positions. So we really need to invest here. We've got some good training and program packages from our International Training Center that we're hoping to roll out in the Pacific. And we need to address this issue, these 4 issues in particular. I'd like to hand back to the chair, please.
Thank you very much for your informative contribution. We also acknowledge the important work of the ILO in this space. So, yeah, you did refer to the Care at Work link to share. We will send that to participants after this session today. Yeah. So the next speaker for today is Cecile Nelson Kongoy of Papua New Guinea. Cecile is a highly experienced corporate specialist with a demonstrated history of working in the program development industry. In her current role as Public Policy and Issues Manager with ExxonMobil, Cecile uses all of her skills in government, policy analysis, risk management, strategic planning, and community development. He has served on many boards and committees and is dedicated to supporting the ongoing development of PNG. The role of private sector collectives is important in discussing private sector development and in lobbying at national level. Cecile actively does this in her role and capacities with different women's business organizations. Her sharing today will show wherein lies the opportunities to build on using Pacific women's networks to implement strategies. So, Cecile, in the business associations you have been involved with, I understand a great part of that work has included the development of a business agenda to assist the women's network to lobby and advocate for the suite of issues facing women in PNG. To what extent has the business agenda considered broader work and employment issues? And given this work commenced pre-COVID, how have you had to pivot to ensure it captures both challenges and opportunities? Thank you, Cecile. You have 7 minutes.
Thank you for the introduction, Atanasi, and very good morning or afternoon to Secretary General Puna, Ambassador Satyandra Prasad, and my fellow esteemed panelists and everyone who's been able to join us for this session today. Thank you for the question too. The coalition that produced the agenda is composed of women leading private sector organizations, as well as civil society members, and is largely concerned with women's ability to thrive in self-employment. So barriers to women's formal employment in PNG have actually led to the emergence and popularity of entrepreneurship as a source of income. Issues related to women's entrepreneurship that appear in the agenda include women's access to finance and transition to the formal economy. Barriers to accessing finance include a lack of collateral, long distances to banks, as well as lack of connectivity to digital banking services, low levels of education for women, which results in difficulty in reading the application materials. Some of these barriers overlap with women's entry into formal economy, including women's literacy levels, access to savings and credit, and more. The PNG ban calls on the government to review the National Financial Inclusion Strategy and the National Informal Economy Policy as a first step to addressing these issues. The agenda also takes a look at women's political participation. Women's enhanced representation in government could also be a driving force for policy reform that improves women's working conditions and their ability to engage in business. The business agenda process was actually launched in February 2020, just as COVID-19 was becoming widespread. So the coalition worked to prioritize issues and solicit input from experts to develop a list of recommendations amidst lockdowns and while balancing the various public health measures that we had in place in PNG. This meant that the pandemic was at the forefront of our minds as we were developing the agenda. Women's access to services, including health, justice, education, and social welfare, was highlighted as a key focus area of the agenda. These issues existed before the pandemic, but COVID-19 exacerbated existing barriers to women's health care and justice and more. Examples of recommendations made by the business agenda include a review of the national strategy to prevent and respond to gender-based violence. This was already a systematic issue before COVID-19, but rates of domestic violence we found increased during the pandemic. And so it prompted the UN to call GBV as the shadow pandemic here. The agenda also includes a recommendation to review the national policy on disability to enhance empowerment and access to services for persons with disabilities in the community. And again, the inclusion of PWD as a pressing issue was a pressing issue before the pandemic, but the forced lockdowns really overburdened the health systems and created new barriers. Thank you, Atenasi.
Thank you, Cecile, for your sharing of PNG's experience. Congratulations too for the work the Business Collective have done on the business agenda and launching. Lots of lessons there that can be gleaned for women in business chapters and national private sector organizations. Right, so our third speaker for the event today is Fantasia Lockington of Fiji. Fantasia is the CEO for the Fiji Hotel and Tourism Association based in Suva, Fiji. In her capacity as CEO, she is the industry's proponent of government engagement for tourism businesses, with strong advocacy for growth opportunities, productivity, and equitable regulatory reforms. She is on several boards, including the Fiji Higher Education Commission, which is key to providing the voice of the private sector and to contribute to Fiji's biggest industry to grow sustainably. It is well known that many tourism-dependent countries, we've touched on this today, have women in the workforce. So I am especially looking forward to hearing from Fantasia on this topic. So the question, Fiji opened its borders 1st December last year. We know tourism is the largest income earner for Fiji, and your organization represents that industry. What would you say have been the noticeable differences pre and post-COVID regarding the changing face of work for those in tourism, and particularly impacts for women? What and how would industry have to adapt going forward? We would be especially keen to hear about where are the opportunities for women in tourism recovery. Thank you, Fantasia. You have 7 minutes.
Vinaka Atanaisi, Secretary General, Ambassador Prasad, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, Nisambula, everybody. Fiji saw the pandemic decimate workers' access to work. Women in particular as the usual sole breadwinners who can, as semi-skilled or non-skilled workers, get employment in tourism businesses were the worst affected. There were no support structures in place, and any support provided came mostly from tourism businesses themselves, like hotels, restaurants, and large retail outlets that essentially supported skilled staff they needed to maintain connections with, especially if they were intending to stay open, even if only on an ad hoc basis initially. Most businesses were unaware for many months just how long it would be before they would reopen. There were other support systems, but very few, but they were extremely helpful. And these came from donor agencies and NGOs. And many of these were channeled through our association to connect with the target audiences, or they requested assistance to understand how to connect with them. And we were very, very happy to do that. The pandemic was obviously unprecedented, as has been said often enough, but Pacific Islanders are resilient. We must be to survive the key to our downside of our beautiful locations, which is weather related, our many cultures that overlap and interact while being aligned as and recognized as collective patriarchal societies, our constant struggle to be recognized as people who are unfairly impacted because of climate change that is not contributed to by ourselves, and our current and collective struggle to achieve very noble SDG goals, some of which can be very challenging for us Pacific Islanders to achieve. The value of tourism on the Fijian economy pegged at around 40%, but perhaps closer to 50% due to the huge supply lines that are connected directly to tourism, and the impact on the 130,000 workers employed directly and indirectly in tourism was realized perhaps for the first time when the borders shut. Even larger support platforms like the Fiji National Provident Fund, when tasked with providing access to workers' funds, was not aware of just how many tourism or tourism-related businesses existed. Eventually, the accessibility had to be opened up to a far wider audience than just tourism-sounding businesses to ensure fairness and parity to all who needed support at this critical time. And for Fiji, that was the first and foremost very critical support system that was provided. When Fiji reopened on the 1st of December, the bulk of the workers that were the first to return were women. It is already an industry that employs 65% of women, and we are acutely aware that we have yet to make any real impact in moving more women into leadership roles. That is not to say that we do not recognize that many women are close to that proverbial glass ceiling, but tourism is an industry that throws more challenges to women moving into leadership roles. And these include the nature of the industry that operates 7 days a week and every day of the year, and essentially never closes. So this in itself is a deterrent to women choosing to become leaders in this industry. COVID has the unenviable distinction of being the first phenomenon to actually shut the industry down. We have found that more men from the industry have moved on to what they consider more job secure areas. Loss of jobs for men has often been more traumatic, while women have been able to find something else to do to support their family, to bide their time while waiting to come back into the industry. And I have no doubt personally that it is a combination of being stronger emotionally, even though you have less formal skills, but you have a more positive attitude and understanding of why you need to, as a woman, need to constantly find a job, and a job that you can train for. And the expectation that running the household and taking care of the family and the family's needs is a woman's responsibility. It is just an island mentality. Post-reopening, the industry has been challenged by many gaps in skilled areas, and a massive amount of training has continued to take place pre and post-reopening. And even now, 4 months later, we are being forced to return to foreign workers to fill these gaps, even if only for shorter periods and for them to train more tourism staff. But the numbers of people who are lining up for these jobs tend to be more women. So what did we learn from the 20 months of border closures and the subsequent reopening? That training support needs to continue, even during our downtimes. Because this keeps people connected, it hones skills, and it keeps up morale generally. People were despairing that they would ever have enough money to feed their families. People were despairing that we would open up the businesses again. So we found that whenever we put out any opportunities for people to train, we had a huge number of people put their hands up and turn up for these. And many of them tended to be women. Support networks also need to be better prepared to understand the different industries and how the challenges impact them. For the tourism industry, for example, nobody quite understood that the workers do not necessarily all come from the areas that they work in. And many of them can travel large distances because the nature of the work is something that they can do. And the key part that we managed to do as an industry was to stay connected continually. During the 20 months of closures, we formed different support groups, different networks that allowed us to be more prepared before the reopening actually was announced. And this has allowed Fiji and the tourism industry specifically to meet the challenges. And the first 2 months of the reopening was extremely challenging, but it was a challenge that we expected and we knew was not going to be easy. So prepare we did, because that's the only thing that we were able to do. And during the entire 20 months that this association stayed online and stayed available to provide advice, to provide connections, and to provide training opportunities where we could, and to stay connected to government so that they understood the challenges that the industry was going through, we found that the people who were most available to come to the table, who were prepared to train, who were prepared to offer what they could, tended to be in large part the women as well. The men might be making more of the decisions, but the women were always available. And so when the industry reopened, it was a key part because of our 65% makeup of our women in the industry who were ready to come back. Satyandra, I hand back over to you.
Thank you very much for your intervention, your point shared today. Congratulations too for the association under your leadership on the national efforts as Fiji opened its borders. As countries face crisis, being resilient is key. Your stories today, you're sharing bridges that CSW review theme and the CSW66 theme most appropriately. So our final speaker for the event today is Barbara Langley of the Center for International Private Enterprise. A special welcome to Barbara. Last year's Pacific Women Triennial Meeting, SIPE worked together with PIFs and others to host a private sector side event. So welcome again and thank you. So this side event has been a great segue from that and continues to show the traction and momentum for women in the private sector. So Barbara serves as Director for SIPE's Center for Women's Economic Empowerment, democratizing opportunity for women by fostering ecosystems for entrepreneurship. In this capacity, she leads SIPE's strategy to amplify the voice of the private sector through women's equal participation in free markets and democratic institutions. Throughout her career, Barbara has conducted coalition building, issues advocacy, good governance and accountability, leadership and strategic planning for business leaders, and many others. She has worked extensively with marginalized sectors of society, including women, youth, and persons with disabilities. So Barbara, your question we pose. SIPE is working with women around the world to share best practices for women's business advocacy and economic empowerment. Recently, you partnered with the Papua New Guinea Business Advocacy Network and launched the first PNG Women's Business Agenda. As we gather for the CSW and use this global policy space to advocate for women's issues and then translate to localizing support, etc., how can agencies like SIPE work with stakeholders to build on this work, noting that private sector are large employers and SIPE has experience in industry work? And how can perhaps other Pacific countries also mobilize technical support for business agenda work? Thank you, Barbara. You have 7 minutes.
Great. Thank you so much, Atanasi. It's wonderful to be here with you all. And a special thank you as well to the Pacific Island Forum, to the Secretary General, and to Ambassador Prasad. We're really appreciative of the partnership in pursuing this side event at CSW. It's really wonderful to be here. And greetings from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where I'm currently teleworking as sort of a personal satellite office to SIPE's headquarters in Washington, DC. I'm really humbled to share the stage with such an impressive range of champions for women's economic empowerment, and I'm really excited to discuss this issue, which I feel so passionately about. And frankly, I'm happy at the placement at the end of the discussion, because I feel like a lot of my points just really put the punctuation mark on a lot of what my colleagues have said as panelists, as the Secretary General, and as the Ambassador, and really will underscore, I think, some of the points that they were making. A little bit about me and why I'm so passionate about this. I actually come from a family of entrepreneurs. My grandparents owned and operated a garage and used car dealership. My father owned and operated a roofing business. My brother currently is running his own residential and commercial electrical business. And the women are not left behind. My sister-in-law is a florist who focuses on arrangements for weddings and other life celebrations. And my niece, a young 30-something, has just launched her first entrepreneurial journey, a flower farm that supplies beautiful fresh flowers to florists and vendors across my hometown and in the neighboring region in Pennsylvania. Excuse me. So I've really witnessed firsthand how the trials and tribulations of the market has impacted their business, and noted really how there needs to be an importance and a focus on a strong entrepreneurial ecosystem to help businesses weather unforeseen issues such as the global COVID-19 pandemic. In some ways, this pandemic has been the great equalizer, but I think we all know very well by now that the experiences across the globe are anything but equal. Here in the United States, we've witnessed greater job losses among women than men, as many of my colleagues have noted. And the reason is understandable. Women often dominate those sectors that are impacted most by the pandemic, such as hotels, restaurants, retail, and others. And certainly, as others have noted, women have also faced the increase of burden of care for children and elderly relatives during the pandemic as well. As we look at the US jobs reports, the examples are really glaring. In particular, I'm remembering back to December 2020, when women accounted for all of the total jobs lost in our country, and women accounting for about 55% of the net jobs lost since the start of the pandemic, I think. And McKinsey, I think this has been noted before, reports that 1 in 4 women are considering leaving the workforce or downshifting their careers versus 1 in 5 men. And as we further break down this group, we see 3 major groups that have experienced some of the largest challenges, particularly here in the United States: working mothers, women in senior management positions, and of course, Black women. However, as we adjust to these new realities, as the market adjusts, we do find some areas of encouragement. Research has found that a lot of women have actually turned to entrepreneurship during the pandemic for a variety of reasons. Likely it's the combination of needing flexible working hours, gaining control over their personal finances, financial imperatives, or job security, as research has noted. But at SIPE in particular, we believe that for women entrepreneurs to thrive, we need to focus on a strong business enabling environment or an ecosystem. And what we mean by that is thinking about this as a holistic approach that's based on 3 levels of entrepreneurial communities. At the individual level, we're talking about a holistic approach that involves fostering an entrepreneurial mindset, developing leadership skills and empowerment and confidence. As the individual starts to grow in their entrepreneurial boots, so to speak, as they lift up their bootstraps, they become part of a larger community, and their voices are elevated as community leaders. Here, it's really important then to help them at this 3rd stage to build relationships by linking community actors and creating collaborative spaces. As that community is maturing, we help them unite with one voice and promote entrepreneur-friendly policies that lower barriers and garner community and official support. I think this final stage really is key, as it serves as a foundation to then bring in and encourage new women entrepreneurs and ensure that a cyclical process continues to feed the ecosystem. Advocacy, whether aimed at public policy or public opinion or even both, helps marginalized segments of the population, like women entrepreneurs, to make their voices heard, making possible more just laws, better democratic institutions, and social norms. To fuel this and to put this into practice, we have, as you mentioned, at SIPE, a tool that we call the Women's Business Agenda, which is an advocacy tool. And it's been employed with much success in many countries around the world. The Women's Business Agenda has been adapted from the advocacy work of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which is the largest and most successful advocacy network in the United States. And it's both a process and a product. Through the process, we're encouraging the development of women's business coalitions to build consensus on a given number of issues impacting women in business, to look at, to then research policy solutions to those issues, and to advocate those solutions with key government and civil society stakeholders. SIPE supplies the technical assistance and facilitates the process initially. However, all decisions on policy priorities and solutions lie with our local partners. It is a local partner-led initiative. SIPE has witnessed coalitions in such countries as Bangladesh, Nepal, and Nigeria transform the way that commercial loans are handled with women business owners, securing gender-sensitized loan desks, and ensuring that movable assets such as equipment, jewelry, or even purchase orders are considered as collateral. So I'm so grateful today to share the stage with PNG Business Advocacy Network Chairperson, Susil Nelson Kongoy. SIPE has supported the Business Advocacy Network in Papua New Guinea on developing their women's business agenda and will continue to provide technical assistance as they begin their advocacy efforts for change that support women in business. And I think as we look to the question that you asked, I think that much can be drawn on their experience and supporting similar efforts across the countries of the Pacific. Networking for the Papua New Guinea Business Advocacy Network and their counterparts will be key. As we go forward, I do ask that you please keep in touch with SIPE. We have a number of free resources on our website that can help you with this ecosystem. And we routinely have small grant opportunities available through our Asia department and through my department at the Center for Women's Economic Empowerment. I will include our website and an email where you can contact the Center for Women's Economic Empowerment at SIPE in the chat as I conclude, but thank you so much for the opportunity. And I'll turn it back to you, Atanasi.
Natasha has a question.
Thank you very much for your contributions, Barbara, and congratulations too for the support to PNG. We look forward to seeing how SIPE can consider working with private sector in other Pacific countries. We will be in touch. So we come to we do have some questions from our attendees to pose to the panel members. If we can just spare some minutes to hear some responses to them. So the first question I have in front of me is for Fantasia. How should Fiji's training institutions, noting many women students, prepare those for the tourism industry going forward, as it's obvious they cannot proceed with business training as normal? Is that okay, Fantasia?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Atanasi. So one of the things that we found had worked with one of our key partners in that area was providing micro-credentials through online learning. The key, I guess the key was remembering that everybody had a smartphone, and that many of our organizations who are our members could actually contact their staff even though they were no longer working with them because they had shut down. So it was a matter of making sure that first of all you could contact people, and we eventually just before reopening did a reminder out to all our members that it should be a key part of their HR that you're constantly updating your contacts, because now people can work from home. You should be able to contact them during crisis, because we were already trying to do that when we had cyclones, flooding, and disasters like that, climate-related disasters. So we found that when we provided micro-credentials, we had a huge amount of women respond to say that they could do that, and a smaller number of men because they felt that that was not something that they could do on a smartphone. But these are things that over the 20 months have changed in terms of perception for society in general. Now you meet anybody on the street and you say, can you do something with your smartphone that will help you get some upskilling? And most of them will now say yes, whereas 20 months ago, before we reopened, or early 2020, most people would have said, no, I don't think that's something that I could do. So it's keeping in mind that Pacific Islands are a little bit more ahead in terms of being very digitally aware and being able to connect regardless of where they are. And those are key opportunities that we can use to continue to train regardless of what's going on.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that response, Fantasia. So this is for Cecile. With regards to the strategy you shared, how would you share that across different business women's networks, and particularly to women at the grassroots, given that there is a big informal economy in PNG? So thank you, Cecile, for your thoughts on that one.
Thank you, Atanasi. So what we've got planned coming up is a series of, because the coalition is made up of, I think, more than 60 members. So we've actually planned a series of workshops, virtual workshops, to be able to reach across into other areas in Papua New Guinea. We have 21 provinces where women can actually dial in. And for those provinces where, lack of connectivity, we plan to actually work through the business chambers in the various provinces to socialize some of the platforms that we're advocating for. So utilizing the business chambers, visitations to the sites, as well as using virtual platforms. Thank you.
Good, thank you so much for sharing that. All right, so I think this is the last one for Johnny and Barbara. So how can those listening in who may wish to access TA or support from ILO and SIPE, how can they do that? Like, do you work primarily via government, is the question. Thank you. Maybe we'll have Johnny first and then Barbara.
Sure, and thank you for the question. So the ILO has a tripartite structure. We work with government, Ministry of Labor is our line ministry, and employers, and then trade unions. So this is the tripartism part. We do have projects, and that's where we and interventions where we work through employers organizations and women entrepreneurs associations, not so much in the Pacific though, but in Southeast Asia, and engaging there through our partners. There's rollout of training and supports, peer-to-peer learning and other aspects, but unfortunately, not so much in the region. And our main office in the region is in Suva, ILO Suva office, where I can leave contacts for getting in touch with them, because there are likely some programs that I'm not so much aware of. So I'll put that in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you, Joni. Barbara.
Yes, thank you so much, Atanasi, and thank you for the question. SIPE is a nonprofit organization, and much of our work relies on grants that we obtain through the United States government, through other foreign governments, and the like. We do have sort of core funding from our umbrella organization, which is the National Endowment for Democracy here in the United States, that gets an annual allocation of funding from Congress. And so in terms of how that works then with local partners, we develop strategies with local business associations, with local chambers of commerce, with other business leaders in particular, to devise strategies that will help that sort of entrepreneurial ecosystem that I talked about. There's also possibilities where we can collaborate and sort of jointly create or co-create different concepts that we might shop around for funding as well. And I think the best way to keep in touch and to brainstorm together and think about ways that we can really find great impact is to, first of all, check out our website, look at our resources that we have there. And then certainly I put the email for my department, siwe@sipe.org, in the chat. Feel free to reach out to us, and we'd be happy to set up a virtual meeting or a meeting on the ground if we can. SIPE does have a country office in Papua New Guinea and a strong team for the Pacific Islands that would be ready, willing, and able to help out and talk with you all about different possibilities or potential concepts. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Barbara. So this is a question that I'll pose to all of you, panel, for this event today. As you're concluding, maybe remarks for our attendees, listeners. So leadership from women has historically been key in crisis, including wars and the pandemic. Traditionally, leadership has been largely framed via masculine qualities such as competitiveness and assertiveness. Feminine leadership qualities such as inclinations for collaboration and inclusivity, prioritizing a long-term interest, considering the well-being of future generations, disposition towards care, selflessness. So what steps can be taken to expand our conception of leadership to include these feminine values, whether in the spheres of entrepreneurship, social endeavors, or politics? So maybe I'll start across my screen, Joni, followed by Fantasia, Barbara, and then Lucille. Thank you.
Thank you for the great question. And it's interesting, I'm involved in documenting profiles of women leaders, promoting circular economy and more sustainable enterprises in the garment sector right now. And we've been analyzing leadership traits and looking how women in leadership positions and the leadership styles are so attuned with today's world of work in that their leadership styles are more, or the ones that I'm looking at anyways, are more pushing towards multiplier effects, looking at how they can leverage others around them, not necessarily taking the top-down approach, asking opinions and getting the best responses. And this is critical for the world of work we're in now. We're constantly evolving, shifting, disrupting, and the world of work needs women in leadership and in social dialogue structures. As I was mentioning earlier, we don't have enough women, and these are where policy decisions and advocacy is happening for the world of work. And we need their views, we need their insights, because they do bring assets to the table, and will need to be taking their voices into account. But if I may, I'd like to also mention another issue. And I know that at CSW, and normally we talk a lot about the importance of ending violence against women and girls. And I'd just like to flag that this is an issue that's stopping women in STEM sectors, in high level, in management and in leadership. And I'd also like to point out that Fiji has taken a leadership role on the international realm of being one of the first countries to ratify ILO Convention, the Violence and Harassment Convention, for eliminating violence and harassment at work, including gender-based violence. And this issue is pervasive. We know a lot about sexual harassment, but there are other forms of violence as well. And with online work and communications, we're not quite on top of things for making sure that this doesn't enter into the risks are there for businesses, and in particular for women who face it disproportionately. So I wanted to make a call in terms of also support to women in higher levels of leadership to eliminate and prevent and protect all workers from violence and harassment at work by ratifying Convention 190, and follow the leadership of Fiji towards other Pacific Island countries. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joni. Fantasia?
Thank you, Atanasi. I had actually written a response to that question. I think it's an excellent question as well. I'd said, yeah, we really must have women either rewrite or help to write those policies, the development programs, or determining what the outcomes for entrepreneurship, social endeavors, or even politics. The women would bring a different perspective and understanding to those policies. And I think that you don't even have to rewrite one that's already there. Just have them cast their eye over it and say, and ask what's missing, what else should be in there. But I believe not enough perspective comes from the women's side of things. And often policies leave that out, that there might be a different way to rewrite that.
Thank you, Fantasia. Barbara?
Yes, thank you, Atanasi. And Joni, thank you so much for raising Convention C190 at the ILO. It is a very important endeavor for sure. And it's one I think that women entrepreneurs and women in business can certainly get behind and be an advocate for as well. We've talked with some of our partners in the Women's Business Association and Women's Chamber world across the globe, and they're interested at bringing that conversation from sort of that international level and having very practical discussions at the country level on this issue and how they might be a champion and advocate for this as well. So thank you for raising that. It is very important. On the issue of leadership, you know, I've worked quite a bit in the political space as well as the economic space. And certainly we as women, we don't always agree with each other on every single thing and every single issue, of course, right? But I think what is critically important in lifting each other up and supporting women's leadership is focusing on those areas where we do agree and creating a coalition that can push forward that low-hanging fruit and gain success on issues that we have in common, that we all agree with, that are of importance to us, and really kind of separating that from the areas where we disagree. I'm reminded in particular of the lessons I've learned from our partners in Nigeria, who have a saying, it's an African proverb of, if we work together, we walk far. And I'm sure I'm messing it up a little bit, but it's so critically important. And in Nigeria, we've been able to work with a coalition that now represents, I believe, close to 50 women business associations and chambers of commerce, representing more than 5 million women across the country. Now, when they want to have a meeting with the minister and they give a call, the minister asks what time they want to come in. It's not that they try to call and call and call and they keep getting put aside. There's power in that coalition. There's power in that voice when we are able to collaborate and work together. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecile. Your observations on that question?
Thank you. A really good question, and it's something that in the various spheres that spaces that I work in, both inside and outside formal employment, it's something that is always talked about, a topic of interest. And just speaking from my experience from the private sector, I think, you know, attracting and developing more women into leadership roles is really a company-wide change, and it's driven from the top. I also think that retention, succession, addressing the skills gap and committing to inclusion are some of the ways organizations can challenge the status quo, because we know that it's not just pay and benefits that attract women. It takes a lot more for women to stay. It depends on, you know, the type of work environment, the flexibility, etc. And then it's also, I think, more needs to be done with a focus on succession. It needs to be a top priority. How do you make sure that in organizations, women are, you know, have that pipeline that they can work their way through to get to the leadership positions that are needed? I also like, especially in my industry that I work in, focus on education. So in particular, STEM. How do we make sure that some of those underrepresented roles, especially in, you know, areas that aren't traditionally female orientated, how do we make sure that there's also inclusion for women in that space? So making sure that, and I think Fantasia talked about some of that as well, skills training. And I think, yeah, I think it's also a future. The future is skills-based. So some of the interviews process, you know, it's very merit-based. And I think that's based on male culture. So we need to look at ways of changing that. How do we program interviews so they focus on skills, so that it removes that gendered sort of view where women have the opportunities to excel and move into some of those positions. Thank you, Atanasi.
Thank you, Cecile. So thank you, all four of you, for the response on that question. I do have one last one. I'm so sorry that just snuck in there. Cecile, this is for you. So, and it's the last one. The women-led countries did better in the pandemic. Could this be because they're more collaborative and don't leave anyone behind? What is your observation on that?
Sorry, Atanasi, could you just say that again? I think you're on mute.
I apologize for that. The women-led countries did better in the pandemic. Could this be because they're more collaborative and don't leave anyone behind? Do you have any observations you wish to make on that one?
I think I tend to agree with that. I think women are more collaborative and are more considered in including everybody. I think that's probably something that we all do well, is have considered views from people as we lead. So I think I agree with that. So I don't really have anything further to comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Cecile. So, and thank you again. We have now come to the end of this side event. Thank you for our excellent panel members in the frank sharing of your experiences and lessons. Thank you too for our audience joining in today. We trust that your expectations in joining this event were met. Acknowledgement, word of acknowledgement. We thank you, SARP, ADV, PSDI, and PIFS too, for supporting this event. Secretary General Henry Puna and His Excellency Ambassador Satyandra Prasad for joining us earlier. So once again, thank you, and I now close this meeting.